Today, we bring you a compilation of 10 terrifying stories that will send shivers down your spine. These spine-chilling tales come from different corners of the world and are sure to keep you on the edge of your seat. From unexplained sightings to sinister hunches, each story is more bone-chilling than the last. So, brace yourself for a frightful journey into the unknown as we dive into 10 scary stories. Don't say we didn't warn you. The empty house. A group of 4 friends decided to explore an abandoned house that had been rumored to be haunted. As they approached the house, they noticed that the windows were boarded up and the front door was padlocked shut. Undeterred, they found a way to climb through a broken window. The inside of the house was dark and musty, and they could hear cracking noises coming from the floors above. As they made their way through the first floor, they noticed that all of the furniture and belongings had been left behind. It was as if the occupants had fled in a hurry and never returned. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash coming from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. The friends froze, unsure of what to do next. Then they heard a footsteps coming down the stairs. They turned to run, but it was too late. A dark figure appeared at the top of the staircase, and they could feel an icy chill wash over them. The figure started to descend the stairs, and as it got closer, they could see that it was a ghostly apparition. Its eyes glowed red, and it let out an ear-piercing scream. The friends were paralyzed with fear as the ghostly figure approached them. Just as it was about to reach them, they woke up realizing it was all just a nightmare. But the fear they experienced in their dream lingered with them for days. The phone call. It was late at night and the woman was alone in her house. Suddenly, the phone rang, and when she answered, all she could hear was a heavy breathing on the other end. "Who is this?" she asked, her heart racing with fear. The breathing stopped, and then a voice whispered,
I know where you live. You can't escape.
The woman slammed the phone down, her hands shaking with terror. She tried to convince herself that it was just a prank call, but deep down, she knew something was very wrong. For the rest of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboard and every rustling of the wind outside made her jump. Then, just before dawn, the phone rang again. This time, she didn't answer, but the ringing continued for hours until she finally unplugged the phone. The woman never found out who made the call, but the fear stayed with her for the rest of her life. She always felt like she was being watched, and she never felt safe in her own home again. The doll. A little girl received a creepy doll as a gift from her aunt. At first, she loved the doll and played with it all the time, but then strange things started to happen. At night, the girl would wake up to find the doll sitting on her chest, staring at her with lifeless eyes. Sometimes, the doll would move on its own, its porcelain limbs cracking as it turned its head to look at her. As time went on, the girl became increasingly afraid of the doll. She tried to get rid of it, but every time she tried, it would somehow find its way back to her room. One night, the girl woke up to find the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes glowing in the dark. It spoke to her in a low, raspy voice, telling her that it was going to take her soul and make her its own. The girl screamed and ran out of the room, but the doll followed her, its small feet pattering on the floorboards. She tried to get help from her parents, but they didn't believe her. Finally, the girl managed to destroy the doll, smashing it to pieces with a hammer. But even then, she could still hear its haunting laughter echoing in her mind. She knew that the doll's spirit would never truly be gone, and that it would always be waiting for her, ready to claim her soul. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Late one night, a man was driving home from a party when he saw a young woman standing by the side of the road, hitchhiking. Feeling sorry for her, he pulled over and offered her a ride. The woman got into the car and gave the man direction to her house. As they drove, they chatted amiably, and the man found himself becoming more and more attracted to her. When they arrived at her house, the woman thanked him and got out of the car but as the man watched, she vanished into thin air, leaving only a cold spot where she had been sitting. Confused and terrified, the man drove away as quickly as he could. When he arrived home, he told his wife what had happened, but she didn't believe him. The man couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started to investigate it, asking around about the woman he had picked up. To his horror, he discovered that she had died many years before in a car accident on the very same road where he had picked her up. From then on, the man was haunted by the memory of the vanishing hitchhiker. He would often see her ghostly figure standing by the side of the road, beckoning him to give her a ride, but he knew better than to stop again. The mirror. A young woman moved into a new apartment and found a beautiful antique mirror at a thrift store. She hung it on the wall in her bedroom and admired it every day. But soon, strange things started to happen. Whenever she looked into the mirror, she felt like someone was watching her. Sometimes she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. One night, the woman woke up to find herself standing in front of the mirror, staring into it with a blank expression. She couldn't remember how she had gotten there or why she was standing in front of the mirror. As the days went on, the woman became more and more obsessed with the mirror. She would spend hours staring into it, her eyes glazed over with a strange, distant look. Her friends and family started to notice that something was wrong, and they tried to intervene, but whenever they tried to take the mirror away or cover it up, the woman would become violent and lash out at them. Eventually, the woman's obsession with the mirror consumed her completely. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and spent all of her time staring into its depths. One day, her friend found her laying on the floor in front of the mirror, her eyes closed and a look of peace on her face. They assumed that she had finally found peace, but when they looked into the mirror, they saw her ghostly figure staring back at them, trapped forever in its glassy depths. The haunted house. A family moved on into a beautiful old house in the countryside, but from the moment they arrived, they knew that something was wrong. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night, and objects would move on their own. The family would wake up to find their belongings scattered around the house, as if someone had been searching through them. The youngest daughter in the family started having terrifying nightmares. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, telling her parents about the ghostly figure that stood at the foot of her bed. The family tried to ignore the strange happening, telling themselves that it was just their imagination, but as the time went on, the haunting became more and more intense. One night, the family heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Thinking that a burglar had broken in, they called the police, but when the police arrived, they found no sign of an intruder. Desperate for answers, the family started researching the history of the house. They discovered that it had been built on the site of an old graveyard, and that the previous owner had all experienced similar haunting. Finally, the family decided that they could no longer live in the house. They packed up their belongings and left, never looking back. Years later, the house still stands empty, a testament to the ghostly presence that still linger within its walls. The family's story is now a cautionary tale for anyone who dare to venture into its haunted depths. The babysitter. A young woman was babysitting for a family in a large spooky house on the outskirts of town. The children were already asleep when she arrived, and the parents left her with a list of instructions before heading out for the night. As the evening wore on, the young woman became more and more uneasy. The house was cracky and old, and the shadows seemed to be alive with the movement. Finally, she decided to settle down and watch some TV, hoping to take her mind off of the eerie atmosphere. But just as she was starting to relax, the phone rang. When she answered, she heard only heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Thinking it was a prank call, she hung up and tried to ignore it. But then the phone rang again, and this time a voice whispered, "I'm watching you." Terrified, the young woman called the police. The police arrived quickly and searched the house, but they found no one. They advised the young woman to leave immediately, and they escorted her out to her car. As she drove away, the young woman glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure in the back seat, watching her with cold, dead eyes. She screamed and swerved off the road, crashing her car. The police arrived to find her body, but the figure in the back seat was nowhere to be found. Some say that it was the ghost of a man who had died in the house years before, watching over the children and seeking revenge on anyone who dared to disturb his peace. The stalker, a young woman, started receiving anonymous love letters in her mailbox. At first she was flattered and assumed that it was a secret admirer, but as the letter continued, they became more and more obsessive and disturbing. The woman began to feel like she was being watched all the time. She would see a figure lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. She tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling persisted. One night, the woman heard a sound outside her bedroom window. When she looked out, she saw a figure standing in her yard, staring up at her window. Terrified, she called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figure had disappeared. They searched the area but found no trace of anyone. The woman tried to move on with her life, but the letters and stalking continued. She changed her phone number and her address, but it didn't seem to make any difference. Finally, one night, the woman heard a sound at the door. When she opened it, she saw the figure from her yard standing in front of her. She screamed and ran, but the figure chased her, brandishing a knife. The woman managed to escape, but she was never the same again. She lived the rest of her life in fear, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if the stalker would come back for her. The identity of the stalker was never discovered, and the woman lived the rest of her life haunted by the mystery of who had been stalking her. The Vanishing Village. A group of friends were on a camping trip in the mountains when they stumbled upon a small, isolated village. The village seemed to be from a different time, with old-fashioned buildings and no modern amenities. At first, the friends were excited to explore the village and learn more about its history, but as they wandered through the streets, they began to feel like they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise and turned to see the village was disappearing before their eyes. Buildings were crumbling dust and the trees were withering away. Panicked, the friends ran back to their campsite and told the authority what they had seen. But when the authority went to investigate, they found no trace of the village. It was as if it had never existed. The friends were left with the haunting memory of the vanishing village, wondering if they had stumbled upon a place lost in time, or if they had been witness to a supernatural event. The mystery of the disappearing village still remained unsolved. The Haunted Doll. A family moved on into an old cracky house and found an antique doll in the attic. The doll was beautiful, with long curly hair and a porcelain face. They placed it on a shelf in the living room, and soon strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small things like objects moving on their own and doors opening and closing. But as time went on, the family began to hear strange whispers and see the doll moving on its own. One night, the mother woke up to find her doll sitting at the foot of her bed, staring at her with lifeless eyes. She tried to move it, but it was too heavy. The family became more and more terrified as the doll's behavior became increasingly violent. It would scratch and claw at anyone who came near it, and it seemed to have a life of its own. Finally, the family decided to get rid of the doll. They took it to a nearby cemetery and buried it deep underground, hoping that it would never be found again. But soon after, strange occurrences began to happen again. The family heard scratching sounds coming from the ground outside, and the doll seemed to be back in the house, more malevolent than ever. The family eventually moved out of the house, leaving the doll buried deep in the ground. But some say that the doll still haunts the old house, waiting for its next victim to come along. The end. Please subscribe and like the video for more content.